"Get your hands off him. He doesn't belong here." The words cracked across the deck like a gavel, sharp enough to slice through the low hum of music and ocean wind. And just like that, every conversation within 20 feet stalled as Malik Jefferson stood at the edge of the yacht's polished teak floor, one step from the boarding ramp, facing a security guard whose grip tightened not out of necessity, but assumption. Malik didn't pull away, didn't argue, didn't even glance at the hand on his arm, because he'd seen this moment before. Different place, same tone, same quiet certainty from people who thought they could read a man's worth by what he wore. And tonight, he wore simplicity on purpose. A fitted black t-shirt, dark denim, clean sneakers, no watch, no chain, nothing that signaled power to those trained to only recognize it in loud packaging. Around them, guests in tailored linen and designer sunglasses paused mid-sip, their champagne glasses hovering in the air like punctuation marks, some whispering, some smirking, one man chuckling under his breath as if the scene confirmed what he already believed. The host, a tall white man in a navy blazer with a voice too confident for someone who hadn't asked a single question, stepped forward and gestured toward the dock with a dismissive flick of his hand, saying, "Invitation-only event, sir. Let's not make this awkward." As if Malik had already crossed a line simply by standing there. Malik's eyes moved slowly across the deck, not searching for approval, not looking for help, just observing, cataloging faces, reactions, silence. Because silence always said more than words, and right now, it was loud. A woman near the bar leaned toward her friend and whispered. He probably thought he could just walk on, while another guest casually raised his phone, not to intervene, but to capture, because moments like this were entertainment when you weren't the one inside them. Malik exhaled once, steady, controlled, the kind of breath that didn't release tension but contained it, and for a brief second, the ocean behind him stretched wide and indifferent, waves rolling in like they had long before any of these people decided who belonged where. The guard shifted slightly, applying just enough pressure to suggest movement, a silent instruction to step back, to leave, to accept the narrative being handed to him. But Malik didn't move, not forward, not back, just still, grounded, as if the deck beneath his feet belonged to him in a way no one else understood. And maybe that was the part that unsettled them, not his presence, but his lack of reaction, because he wasn't playing the role they expected, wasn't raising his voice, wasn't pleading his case, wasn't trying to prove anything, and that quiet refusal to perform made the air feel charged, like something was about to shift. The host's smile tightened, thinner now, less confident, as he added, "We've got important guests on board tonight," emphasizing the word important just enough for everyone within earshot to hear the implication, and a few heads nodded in agreement, subtle, almost automatic, like they were aligning with a script they'd seen before. Malik finally turned his head, just slightly, meeting the host's eyes for the first time, and in that moment, there was no anger there, no embarrassment, just a calm that didn't match the situation, a calm that felt out of place on a dock where he was being told he didn't belong. And that contrast between what was happening to him and how he carried it began to ripple through the crowd in a way no one could quite explain yet, because they were all waiting for the same thing, for him to react, to break, to confirm their assumptions. But Malik Jefferson didn't break, he didn't argue, he didn't leave, he just stood there, quiet, composed, as if the story they thought they were watching hadn't even started yet. The silence did not break, it stretched, thin and tight like a wire pulled across the deck, and Malik Jefferson could feel every eye still locked onto him, waiting, measuring, deciding what he was worth without ever asking who he was. And the security guard, sensing that hesitation from the crowd, adjusted his stance and said more firmly, "Sir, I am going to need you to step back onto the dock," his tone no longer polite but practiced, the kind used when a decision has already been made. Malik's gaze drifted past him, across the glowing string lights, the polished railings, the skyline reflecting off the water like a mirror of wealth and access. And for a moment, the scene overlapped with another memory. Years earlier, standing outside a rooftop lounge in Chicago, 22 years old, freshly graduated, suit pressed, credentials ready, only to be told by a man at the door that the venue was at capacity. Then watching 3 men walk in behind him without a question, laughing, welcomed, belonging, And that night he had stood on the sidewalk for a full minute longer than he should have, not because he needed to get in, but because he needed to understand what it meant to be seen and still be dismissed. The present snapped back in, sharper now, as a woman near the edge of the deck spoke just loud enough to be heard. If he had an invite, he would have shown it by now, and someone beside her nodded, adding, "Exactly. They always try to argue instead of just leaving." And that word always landed heavier than anything else, because it carried history without ever naming it. Malik shifted his weight slightly, not in retreat but in balance, his shoes still planted on the threshold between the dock and the yacht, as if that line itself had become symbolic, not just a step, but a decision about who was allowed to cross. The host exhaled, impatience creeping into his posture now, and took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to sound controlled but not enough to hide the edge. "Listen, I do not want to make a scene, but we have standards for this event, and I suggest you respect them." And there it was again, that word, standards, dressed up like policy but delivered like judgment. A few guests exchanged glances, some uncomfortable now, others still entertained, and near the bar, a younger woman with a staff badge hesitated, her eyes flicking between Malik and the guest list tablet in her hand, as if something did not quite add up. But before she could speak, another staff member gently touched her elbow and shook his head, a silent instruction to stay out of it. Malik noticed that, the hesitation, the almost voice that never became sound, because moments like this were rarely about one person, they were about systems, about who felt safe speaking and who had learned not to. The guard's grip loosened slightly, not out of respect but uncertainty, because Malik's stillness was starting to disrupt the rhythm of the situation, and without that expected resistance, the script they were following began to falter. Malik's hand moved slowly, deliberately, not toward the guard, not toward the host, but toward his pocket, and a few people straightened instinctively, attention sharpening, curiosity replacing certainty, as he pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up his face in a soft glow that contrasted with the tension around him. He did not rush, did not fumble, just unlocked it with a calm familiarity, as if he had done this before, as if this moment was not unexpected but anticipated, and in a quiet voice that did not seek permission, he said into the receiver, "Connect me to the board line, now." No explanation, no urgency, just clarity, and on the other end, a voice responded immediately, professional, ready. "Yes, Mr. Jefferson, we are standing by." But no one else heard that part clearly. They only saw the shift, the subtle change in posture, in presence, as if the man they had been dismissing a moment ago had just stepped into a different frame entirely. The host's expression flickered, just for a second, a crack in confidence that he quickly tried to seal with a forced smile. "Calling someone is not going to change the situation," he said, louder now, reclaiming the attention of the crowd. But the words did not land the same way they had before, because something had already begun to shift, something quiet and irreversible, and Malik, still calm, still composed, lowered the phone slightly, his eyes lifting from the screen back to the people in front of him, not challenging, not pleading, just present, and in that presence, there was a weight that had not been there before, the kind that made conversations slow, smiles fade, and certainty dissolve, because the story they thought they were watching was no longer predictable, and for the first time since the glass shattered, no one was entirely sure who was supposed to leave. The air did not just shift, it tightened, like something unseen had entered the space and quietly taken control of it. And Malik Jefferson stood there with his phone lowered at his side, not speaking, not moving, but somehow commanding more attention than the music, the skyline, or the host who had just tried to remove him. And that alone unsettled people. The guard glanced at the host, waiting for the next instruction. But the confidence that had been there minutes ago was no longer solid. It flickered, uncertain, because Malik had not reacted the way they expected, and now the situation no longer felt routine. Near the bar, the young staff member who had hesitated earlier looked down at the tablet again, her thumb hovering over the screen as if debating whether to scroll, whether to confirm something she was not supposed to question, and this time she did, just a small movement, but enough, her eyes narrowing as she read, then lifting again toward Malik with a different kind of focus, one that no longer matched the narrative being pushed in front of her, A man in a white blazer leaned toward another guest and whispered, "Why is he so calm?" And the other replied, "Because he knows he is getting kicked out." But even as he said it, his voice lacked conviction, because calm like that did not look like defeat. It looked like control. The host cleared his throat, louder now, trying to reclaim the room. "All right, let us keep things moving," he said, clapping his hands once as if that could reset the moment. But no one moved. Not really, because attention had already anchored itself to Malik, and people were no longer just watching a removal. They were waiting for an outcome. Malik's gaze shifted slightly, landing on the staff member with the tablet, and for a brief second, their eyes met, and something passed between them. Not recognition exactly, but possibility, the kind that appears when doubt enters a system built on certainty. The guard's hand dropped fully now, no longer guiding, no longer enforcing, just present without purpose, and that small change did not go unnoticed, because power, real power, rarely announces itself loudly. It reveals itself in what people stop doing. Malik took one step forward, not onto the yacht, not away from it, just enough to reposition himself so that he was no longer being directed, and that step alone shifted the geometry of the moment, placing him at the center rather than the edge. His phone vibrated softly in his hand, and he glanced down, not hurried, not surprised, just confirming. And then he lifted it again, bringing it closer, listening for a second, nodding once, and saying quietly, "Keep the line open," before lowering it again. The host noticed that, and for the first time, his expression changed in a way he could not fully hide, not fear exactly, but awareness. The kind that comes when a situation stops being simple. Behind him, one of the guests pulled out his own phone, not to record this time, but to check something, typing quickly, searching, and a few seconds later, his posture shifted, subtle but real, as he leaned toward someone else and said under his breath, "Wait a second." And that was all it took, because doubt spreads faster than certainty when it finds the right moment. The staff member with the tablet took a small step forward, her voice careful but audible. "Excuse me," she said, not to Malik, but to the host, and the word itself carried weight because it interrupted a script that was supposed to be one-sided. And when she spoke again, there was hesitation, but also resolve. "I think we should double-check the guest list." The host turned toward her sharply. "Too quickly." "We already did," he replied. But the confidence in his tone no longer matched the situation unfolding around him. Malik remained still, watching, not interfering, because this was no longer about proving anything himself. It was about letting the system reveal itself. And as the murmurs around the deck grew quieter, more focused, more curious than dismissive, it became clear that something had already changed, something invisible but undeniable, and whatever came next was not going to follow the script they started with. "Check it again," she said, and this time her voice did not disappear into the background. It cut through the low murmur of the deck just enough to force attention, and the young staff member stepped forward with the tablet held firmly in both hands, no longer hovering at the edge of the moment, but stepping directly into it. Her eyes locked on the screen, and then lifting to the host with a steadiness that had not been there before. The host's jaw tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing his face as he replied, "I already told you, he is not on the list." But his tone had shifted, less absolute, more defensive, because now there was an audience listening for the answer, not just accepting it. She did not step back, did not lower the tablet. Instead she angled it slightly, just enough for him to see without fully offering it, and said, "There are restricted entries on this list, names that are not visible on the main display." And that single sentence landed differently, heavier, because it introduced something the crowd had not considered, the idea that not everything important was meant to be obvious. A few guests leaned in, curiosity replacing confidence, and one man who had been quietly watching now spoke up. "What does that mean, restricted?" And the question hung in the air, simple but disruptive, because it forced the situation out of assumption and into explanation. The host exhaled sharply, glancing around as if measuring how much control he still had, then said, "It means nothing relevant to this situation." But even as he said it, the certainty felt thinner, stretched, like it could tear at any moment. Malik Jefferson did not move, did not interrupt, He simply watched as the narrative that had been built around him began to loosen, thread by thread, and in that stillness, his presence grew heavier, more defined. Not because he said anything, but because he did not need to. The staff member tapped the screen once, then again, scrolling carefully, her brow tightening as she read, and then she stopped, her finger hovering over a single line, her eyes widening just slightly before she looked up again, this time directly at Malik, not with doubt, but with recognition that had just begun to form. The host noticed that look, and his voice sharpened. "Give me that," he said, reaching for the tablet. But she hesitated, just long enough for that hesitation to be seen, to be felt. And in that fraction of a second, the balance of the moment shifted again. A woman near the railing whispered, "Something is off," and the man beside her nodded slowly, his earlier amusement gone, replaced by focus, because the situation no longer felt like a simple mistake. It felt like something unfolding in real time. Malik's phone vibrated again, a soft, controlled interruption, and he lifted it slightly, listening for only a second before responding in a low, even tone. "Proceed." One word, no explanation, and then he lowered it once more, as if whatever was happening on the other end was already in motion, already beyond the need for discussion. The guard, who had once stood firm, now shifted his weight back, creating space without being told, and that small retreat did not go unnoticed, because it signaled something deeper than uncertainty. It signaled recognition that the situation might not be what it seemed. The host took a step closer to the staff member, his voice dropping, controlled but edged. "You are overstepping," he said, but she did not lower her gaze this time, did not hand over the tablet immediately. Instead, she said quietly, "I just think we should verify before we remove anyone." And the word remove echoed differently now, no longer a simple action, but a potential mistake. A man in the crowd raised his phone again, not to capture a spectacle, but to document a moment that had become unclear, unpredictable, and several others followed, not out of excitement, but out of instinct, because something about this no longer felt routine. Malik stood at the center of it all, unchanged, his posture steady, his expression calm, as if he had already seen how this would unfold, and in that calm, there was a quiet authority that no one had acknowledged at the beginning, but everyone was beginning to feel now. The staff member finally turned the tablet slightly outward, just enough for the host to see what she was seeing, and for a brief second, his eyes locked onto the screen, and whatever he read there did not just surprise him, it unsettled him, because his expression shifted, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that happens when certainty collapses from the inside. And though he said nothing, the silence that followed spoke louder than anything he could have said, because now, for the first time since Malik stepped onto that dock, the question was no longer whether he belonged, but whether they had just made a mistake they could not easily undo. The host did not speak immediately, and that silence was louder than anything he had said all night. His eyes still locked on the tablet as if the words on the screen had rearranged everything he thought he understood about the moment, and for a brief second, the polished confidence he had carried like a uniform slipped, revealing something less certain underneath. Malik Jefferson watched without expression, but inside, the moment stretched deeper than the deck, deeper than the yacht, pulling him backward through time to a memory he had not needed to revisit in years, standing outside a private investment dinner in Manhattan, 30 years old, already managing millions in assets. Invitation confirmed twice, only to be stopped at the entrance by a man who looked at his name, then at his face, then back at the list, and said, "There must be a mistake." And Malik had stood there, not because he doubted his place, but because he understood what was being tested, not his credentials, but his composure. Back then, he had waited while they verified, while they questioned, while they delayed, and when they finally let him in, no apology came, only silence, as if the inconvenience had belonged to him. And that night, he made a decision that would follow him into rooms like this one, that he would never argue for access again. He would let the truth arrive on its own terms. The present snapped back into focus as the host finally looked up from the tablet. His posture subtly altered, shoulders tighter, voice measured in a way it had not been before. "There seems to be a discrepancy," he said, choosing the word carefully, as if it could soften what was unfolding. But the crowd did not hear reassurance, they heard Uncertainty. The staff member held her ground, her voice steadier now. It is not a discrepancy. It is a restricted entry, she replied, and the distinction mattered, because one suggested error, the other suggested intent. A murmur moved through the guests, not loud, but unified, like a shift in current, and the man in the white blazer leaned closer again, whispering, "Restricted for who?" And no one answered, because the answer was no longer obvious. Malik's phone vibrated once more, a quiet signal, and he lifted it just enough to hear the voice on the other end say, "We have confirmation, sir." And he responded with a single word, "Understood," before lowering it again, his face unchanged, but his presence somehow heavier, as if the room itself had begun to adjust around him. The guard took another small step back, creating distance that had not been there before, his earlier authority dissolving into caution, and that shift did not go unnoticed by the guests, because people recognize when control changes hands, even if no one announces it. The host cleared his throat again, this time not to command attention, but to regain it. "Let us not jump to conclusions," he said, but the phrase felt late, reactive, because the conclusion had already begun forming in the minds of everyone watching, not through what was said, but through what had changed. The staff member finally turned the tablet outward just enough for the nearest guests to catch a glimpse, not the full detail, but enough, a name, a designation, something that did not match the way Malik had been treated minutes ago, and a woman near the railing inhaled sharply, her voice low but clear. "That cannot be right." But it was, and the doubt in her tone was not about the information. It was about the situation they had all just witnessed. Malik shifted his gaze across the deck once more, not seeking validation, but acknowledging the shift, the subtle realignment of perception, and for a moment, the ocean behind him seemed quieter, as if even the background had softened to let the moment stand on its own. The host's composure wavered again, just slightly, as he stepped closer, lowering his voice in an attempt to contain the situation. "If there has been a misunderstanding, we can resolve it privately," he said, but the offer came too late, because the moment was no longer private. It had never truly been, and now it belonged to everyone watching. Malik did not respond, did not accept, did not reject. He simply stood there, letting the weight of the situation settle fully into the space, because this was no longer about being allowed in. It was about what had already been revealed, and as the murmurs quieted into focused silence, one truth became impossible to ignore. The man they had tried to remove had never been out of place. They had just failed to recognize where the power in the room actually stood. The moment did not explode. It deepened, settling into the kind of silence that forces people to think before they speak. And Malik Jefferson remained exactly where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, allowing the weight of what had just been revealed to do the work for him. Because real power does not rush, it waits. The host shifted again, this time more noticeably, his posture tightening as he glanced from the tablet to Malik and then to the surrounding guests, as if recalculating his position in a situation that no longer belonged to him. And when he spoke, his voice carried a different tone, one that tried to recover authority but could not fully hide the shift. "We may need to clarify a few details," he said, but the phrasing sounded smaller now, less like a command and more like a request. The staff member did not respond immediately, her eyes still fixed on the screen as if confirming what she had already seen, and then she said quietly, but clearly enough for those closest to hear, "This entry is not just restricted, it is marked as ownership level." And that phrase moved through the crowd like a current, subtle but undeniable, because it introduced a reality that no one had considered at the beginning of the night. A man near the bar straightened, his expression shifting from curiosity to recognition, and he murmured, "Ownership," as if testing the word out loud, while another guest quickly unlocked his phone, typing, searching, connecting pieces that had not seemed connected before. Malik's phone vibrated again, and this time when he lifted it, he did not need to say much. Only, "Go ahead," and the response on the other end came. Immediately, precise, and controlled. "The notifications have been sent, sir. All parties are aware." And Malik lowered the phone once more, his calm unchanged, but the timing of everything around him beginning to align in a way that felt deliberate. The host noticed the shift in attention, The way people were no longer looking at Malik with doubt, but with growing awareness, and he took a small step closer, lowering his voice as if trying to contain the situation before it expanded further. If there has been an oversight, we can correct it right now, he said, but the word oversight landed awkwardly, because it suggested something accidental, and nothing about what had happened felt accidental anymore. The guard, now fully withdrawn from his earlier position, stood slightly off to the side, no longer the center of enforcement, but a witness to a situation that had moved beyond him, and that change in placement, in role, reflected something larger happening across the deck, a quiet redistribution of authority that no one had announced but everyone could feel. Near the railing, the same woman who had whispered earlier now spoke again. But this time there was no dismissal in her tone, only realization. They tried to remove him without even checking, and the man beside her nodded slowly, adding, "And now they are checking because something does not add up," and those words carried weight because they reframed the entire moment, not as a misunderstanding, but as a sequence of choices. Malik's gaze moved across the deck once more, steady, observant, taking in the shifting expressions, the fading confidence, the growing silence, and for a brief second, his mind returned to that earlier version of himself, standing outside that Manhattan building, waiting for validation that should not have been necessary, and the contrast between then and now was not loud. It was precise, because back then he had waited for permission, and now, he had already built the room that required none. The staff member finally turned the tablet fully toward the host, no longer hesitating, no longer uncertain, and whatever he saw this time removed the last layer of doubt from his expression, because his shoulders dropped slightly, his breath slowing, as if the reality of the situation had fully settled in. The crowd did not need to see the screen, they could read it in his reaction, in the way his posture shifted from control to recognition, and that was enough, because perception had already turned. Malik remained still, his presence now undeniable, not because he had claimed it, but because the room had begun to recognize it on its own, and in that recognition, the tension that had once pushed him outward now pulled inward, focusing entirely on him. The host opened his mouth to speak again, but this time there was a pause, a hesitation that had not existed before, because the words he had used earlier no longer fit the reality in front of him, and as that hesitation stretched, the entire deck seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when everything would finally be said out loud, the moment when the truth would no longer be implied but declared, and Malik Jefferson, calm and unshaken, stood at the center of it, knowing that the next sentence would not just change the room, it would redefine it. The silence reached its peak, not loud, not chaotic, but absolute, the kind that makes every breath in the room feel intentional, and Malik Jefferson finally moved, not forward in urgency, but forward in clarity, one measured step onto the deck that no one tried to stop this time, because something had already shifted beyond control, beyond assumption, beyond the fragile authority that had tried to push him away minutes earlier. The host straightened instinctively, as if preparing to regain command, but the words did not come. They stalled somewhere between recognition and consequence, and Malik, calm as ever, lifted his gaze and met his eyes fully, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a quiet certainty that carried more weight than any raised voice could. The crowd leaned in without realizing it, conversations gone, phones lowered, because this was no longer spectacle, this was resolution. And Malik spoke, his voice even, controlled, cutting through the air with precision. "You did not remove a guest tonight," he said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle. "You removed the man who funded this entire event." And the sentence did not echo. It landed, heavy, final, undeniable, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to stop. The host's expression froze, not dramatically, but completely, as if every calculation he had been making collapsed at once, his shoulders lowering slightly, his grip on the situation gone, and behind him, one of the guests inhaled sharply, the sound small but amplified in the silence, while another whispered, "Wait, what?" as if trying to catch up to a reality that had just rewritten itself. The staff member holding the tablet did not move, her eyes shifting from Malik to the screen and back again, confirming what she already knew, while the guard, now fully removed from his earlier stance, took another step back, creating space. Not out of instruction, but understanding. A phone buzzed somewhere in the crowd, then another, then several more. A chain reaction of notifications that rippled through the deck, subtle but unmistakable, and one guest looked down at his screen, his expression changing as he read, then turning it slightly toward the person beside him. "This is him," he said under his breath, and that was all it took. Because recognition spreads faster than doubt when the truth aligns, the host opened his mouth. But whatever response he had prepared no longer fit the moment, and for the first time, his voice did not lead the room. It followed it, uncertain, trying to catch up to something that had already moved past him. "Mr. Jefferson, we were not aware," he began, but the sentence felt incomplete even as he spoke it, because awareness was never the issue. Assumption was. Malik did not interrupt, did not raise his voice. He simply held his gaze, letting the weight of what had been said do its work, because the sentence had already done everything it needed to do. It had redefined the room, shifted the power, exposed the gap between perception and reality. Around them, the atmosphere changed in a way that could not be reversed, the earlier laughter gone, replaced by a quiet tension that felt closer to accountability than discomfort, and the same guests who had whispered before now stood still, watching, processing, recalibrating. Malik's presence, once questioned, now anchored the entire space, not because he demanded it, but because it had been revealed, and in that revelation, there was no need for further explanation, no need for argument. Only the undeniable truth of what had just been spoken. The ocean behind the yacht moved steadily, indifferent to the shift that had just occurred, but on the deck, everything had changed, and as the silence settled again, deeper this time, more complete, it became clear to everyone present that the moment they thought they controlled had never belonged to them at all. It had been waiting for this one sentence to arrive. The silence did not break immediately. It transformed, shifting from shock into something heavier, something that settled into the space like truth finally acknowledged, and Malik Jefferson stood exactly where he had been, unchanged, as if nothing about him needed to adjust now that everything else had. The host blinked once, then again, as if trying to process the gap between what he had assumed and what had just been revealed, and his voice, when it returned, was no longer leading, it was following. "Mr. Jefferson, I apologize," he said, the words careful, measured, but carrying none of the authority they had before, because apology, in that moment, was not power, it was recognition of its absence. Malik did not respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but because he did not need to fill the space. The moment was already doing that, and around them, the crowd shifted, not physically, but perceptually, people straightening, adjusting their posture, their expressions, as if trying to realign themselves with a reality they had failed to see minutes earlier. The same man in the white blazer who had whispered before now spoke more openly. "That is him. I knew the name sounded familiar." And another guest nodded quickly, pulling up an article on his phone, scrolling, confirming, and within seconds, the quiet ripple of recognition spread outward, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable, like a current moving through every conversation at once. The staff member holding the tablet stepped back slightly, not retreating, but repositioning, her role in the moment complete. Her earlier hesitation replaced by a quiet certainty that she had done what needed to be done, while the guard, now fully removed from any position of control, stood to the side, hands at his sides, no longer part of the decision, only a witness to its outcome. The host took another breath, deeper this time, as if grounding himself in a situation he no longer controlled. "We would be honored to have you on board," he added, the shift in language clear, immediate, but the offer hung in the air differently now, because it was no longer about access. It was about recovery, about trying to repair something that had already been exposed. Malik's gaze moved across the deck once more, taking in the changed expressions, the softened tones, the absence of laughter, and in that sweep, there was no satisfaction, no visible reaction at all, only observation, as if he were measuring not the apology, but the moment itself. A woman near the railing lowered her phone slowly, her earlier posture of passive observation replaced by something more reflective, and she said quietly, almost to herself, "They were so sure," and the Man beside her replied, just as quietly. They always are. And those words carried weight because they extended beyond the yacht, beyond the night, into something larger that did not need to be named to be understood. Malik finally shifted his stance, not toward the host, not toward the invitation, but slightly inward, grounding himself in the space that had just been redefined. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, not raised, not sharp, but clear enough that it carried across the deck without effort. You were not wrong about one thing, he said, pausing just enough for the attention to settle again. This event does have standards. And the sentence held for a moment, balanced, before he continued. You just applied them without understanding what they were. And that was all. No lecture, no escalation, just a statement that reframed everything that had happened. The host lowered his gaze slightly, the weight of that sentence landing in a way that no argument could have achieved. And around them, the guests remained still, not out of obligation, but because the moment had shifted into something more than a correction. It had become a reflection. Malik did not step further onto the yacht, did not claim the space in the way they now expected him to. Instead, he remained where he was, at that same threshold. Because the point had never been entry, it had been recognition, and now that recognition had arrived, fully, undeniably, the room no longer needed to be convinced. It only needed to sit with what it had revealed about itself. And in that quiet, steady aftermath, the power in the space did not feel louder. It felt clearer, sharper, and entirely unchanged by the noise that had tried to define it moments before. Malik Jefferson did not move right away, and that stillness became the final statement before any words were needed, because the room had already shifted, already learned something it could not unlearn. And as the ocean moved quietly behind the yacht, the contrast between what had just happened and what should have happened settled fully into the space. The host remained in front of him, no longer blocking, no longer directing, just present, waiting, his earlier authority replaced by something closer to accountability. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more careful. We take full responsibility for what happened, he said, but the words felt smaller than the moment, because responsibility, once delayed, never carries the same weight. Malik finally stepped forward, not in acceptance of the invitation, but in ownership of the moment itself. His presence now fully inside the space that had once tried to reject him. And as he moved, no one interrupted, no one questioned. Because the narrative had already been rewritten, he stopped near the center of the deck, turning slightly so that his voice would carry not just to the host, but to everyone within earshot. And when he spoke, it was not loud, but it was unmistakably clear. This was never about access, he said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle. It was about assumption. And the sentence landed with the kind of clarity that did not need repetition, because every person there understood exactly what it meant. A few guests lowered their gaze. Others remained still, absorbing, reflecting, and the earlier energy of the party, the music, the laughter, the easy confidence, had not just faded. It had been replaced by something more aware, more deliberate, as if the room itself had matured in a matter of minutes. Malik's eyes moved across the deck one last time, not searching, not judging, just acknowledging, and in that quiet scan, there was no need for further correction, because the lesson had already been delivered, not through confrontation, but through contrast. The staff member with the tablet stood near the edge, watching with a quiet sense of resolve, understanding now that speaking up had mattered, while the guard remained off to the side, his earlier certainty replaced by reflection. And even the guests who had once whispered now stood in silence, their assumptions no longer invisible, no longer unquestioned. Malik took a breath, steady, controlled, and then he added one final line, not directed at any single person, but at the moment itself. I did not raise my voice tonight, he said, his tone even, grounded. I raised the standard. And with that, the meaning of everything that had happened settled into place, not as a spectacle, not as a confrontation, but as a recalibration of what respect actually requires. He did not wait for applause, did not wait for acknowledgement, because neither was necessary. Instead, he turned slightly, his posture unchanged, and began to move across the deck with the same quiet confidence he had arrived with. But now, the space moved with him, not against him, because recognition had replaced resistance. The host stepped aside instinctively, not out of instruction, but understanding, and as Malik passed, there was no attempt to reclaim control, no attempt to reframe the moment, because it had already been defined in a way that could not be undone. Behind him, the murmurs did not return to what they had been before. They remained softer, more thoughtful, as if everyone present was still processing the shift that had just taken place. And even as the music slowly resumed, it carried a different tone, less carefree, more aware. Malik did not look back, because he did not need to. The room would remember, not just who he was, but what had been revealed, and as the yacht continued to drift along the water, one truth remained clear. Above everything else, respect is not proven by appearance. It is revealed by how you treat someone before you know who they are, and on that night, that lesson did not need to be repeated, it had already been lived.